Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's Sensafili Sparring Partners webinar on energy efficiency in private networks. Our speakers today are Simon Fletcher, CSO at the Small Cell Forum, and Monica Paolini, Principal at Sensafili. I'm Kendra Chamberlain, and I will be moderating our webinar today. In Sparring Partners debates, we watch our experts discuss a topic live on video. We would like to encourage our audience to participate in the conversation. So please share your questions and comments using the chat function on the Zoom taskbar. All comments are visible to all participants, so please keep the conversation polite and respectful. Our speakers will do their best to address questions as they go along and as they become relevant to the topics being discussed. So please do not hold your questions until the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to Monica.
Kendra, so much for the introduction, and thank you all for attending, and Simon for being with us today. This is really, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on how we got this Sparring Partners going. It's somewhat different. I usually know the people that are on Sparring Partners. Because when you have a conversation, it's nice to have somebody you know and you respect, and you know that it's going to be a great host. But with Simon, that's also true. But also, we had quite a long conversation. It took us a couple of hours unexpectedly, and then we had to go, and we didn't get really to the bottom of the whole topic, I think. And so what we're trying to do is to distill that. It was a really fascinating discussion that we had, and so I look forward to sort of continue this and bring you in, which is the whole purpose of Sparring Partners, to bring you in a conversation that it's a real conversation, in the sense that, no PowerPoint, but also trying to get to the bottom of questions that are sometimes inherently complicated. So we're not going to have a 1, 2, 3 bullet point answer to any of the things that we're going to be talking about today, but it's really going to be a discussion of trying to find out how we think about this. And what this is today is energy efficiency in private networks. And this is sort of a broad concept, because we're going to talk about private networks, indoor, small cells, but not necessarily all of the above. Is how do we think about networks that are providing connectivity that are not necessarily managed by operators, or operators might manage on behalf of another organization. And so clearly we want them to be energy efficient, but how do we think about that? Let alone how do we solve the problem? So Simon, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Monica.
Maybe you can introduce, I think most of the people in the audience know very well who you are, but
I think it might be, I don't know, it might be useful just to say briefly what the mission of the Small Cell Forum is, because I guess that informs where we're coming from. A lot of people may think that we're principally serving the mobile operator view, but that's, that may well have been the case 10 years ago when it was called the Femto Forum, but over the years we've evolved very much into a view that's trying to create a sustainable digital transformation story for industries and enterprises, and of course, operators are part of that ecosystem, and also thinking about community connectivity as well. Trying to support a range of sort of what I call agile and cost effective. That's the important point when we're talking about sustainability and energy efficiency. Scalable cellular infrastructure. So it's really just trying to provide those technologies, those options, those architectures. And I think what I would emphasize is, of course, mobile operators play in that space. But what we're very focused on at the moment is developing the capabilities and understanding in sort of emerging service providers and in deployers of systems. For me, that's a very interesting segment that's starting to play out and gaining strength as they go forward. and maybe could not. Oh,
I was on mute because there was some audio feedback. Sorry about that. But yeah, and I think that this is really interesting because we are seeing a growth, and there is a prospect for a lot of growth in cellular connectivity that is not necessarily managed by operators. So it's really interesting to see how everything is going to fit together, because when you have your phone or whatever device you have, you're going to be connected to one network. Well, you might be connected to more networks, but there are going to be more networks you can connect to at the same time.
Yeah, totally. The area is really quite interesting for us in this emerging new deployers, and to some actually they're not so new. It's what we would call neutral hosts, who generally are hosting public network services, has been the traditional model. But they're very interested now and see the opportunity to provide that private service, because the asset they have is, they are in situ, they are deploying special purpose networks, principally for the benefit of sharing and providing a neutral platform for a number of public operators, but also, they're trying to serve the local community, the local environment where they're deploying. It's important because their business model, they monetize on the basis of that local deployment. They're different from a national mobile operator, their business model encompasses the nation, and they have many opportunities to monetize. But the neutral host is in situ, and they need to make the business model work for them local. And private network offerings, either through a small cell or other deployment that is providing that capability in terms of the public network, but also trying to provide additional value creation with a private network option for that local community is the right place for them to be. So they're an important part of the ecosystem.
Not only that, but also a big potential part of the energy efficiency as well, just the sharing part, the neutral host. And I actually did another sparring partner with Mark Gilbert from Connectivity that we talked about infrastructure sharing. There we talked more about the transport side, but we also talked about the access side. And clearly, especially if you get into the in-building or campus or sort of some sort of non-wide area network, not wide area environment, if you share the infrastructure, you're going to be much more efficient, because you're much better off having one network. I mean, we're not talking about competition here. We're talking about the efficiency. If you have one big network shared by different providers, generally speaking, you should be more energy efficient than having multiple ones. And also more energy efficiency than using the macro to connect. So if I'm inside a building, especially in Europe where you tend to have thicker walls, I'm going to consume much more energy from my phone to connect to the macro than to connect to the whatever infrastructure is there, other things being equal.
Yeah, totally right. And I think that actually came out in your report. I don't know whether the audience has seen that yet, but certainly you've shared a version with me, which is very interesting. And that view around the in-building, outside in is articulated there. I mean, certainly when you're thinking about energy efficient from a system level, and so not just the infrastructure, but when we're trying to find the gains and the benefits and the savings across an average base of users and an average demand over a period of time, the more devices that are having to connect from indoor to outdoor, on average, the performance of the system energy-wise is not going to be great, and ultimately the users of the devices are going to have a shorter battery life. If you're having to launch your uplink to a base station that's half a kilometre away, then you're already playing. You're not playing fairly with the energy budget. So yeah, having a small cell connection option within the building is a good thing to do in terms of that end-to-end energy story, making sure you have an efficient transport of the services.
Yeah, and I guess that we often look, in our daily job at the consumption from a mobile operator perspective. What is that they're using? But actually, there is a lot of energy use. So if we look at the society level, at the high level of what we use as a society, is actually our devices use more energy than the network. So it's actually important. It's not just the battery life in the sense that our phone is going to run out of battery, but clearly that's energy that you're consuming as well. So if we really think about that, that's clearly another important thing. It's the report that the mobile operator publishes on a yearly basis or whatever doesn't take that into account, obviously, because we don't know what's happening on the other end. But it is part of the equation.
Yeah, totally. I mean, even if you have a good quality link, which I mean you won't, you're transmitting over distance, so you got your propagation losses anyway. And we're talking about marginal energies, but this, it's aggregated over thousands, hundreds of thousands of devices connecting. We need to think about that level. We can't just only think about a single transaction over a network. We've got to think about averages and on average how we're going to get better performance in the networks. So you've obviously got the issue in terms of the uplink and the device trying to get a good quality link. But generally, if the radio channel is poor and you need to start going into the hybrid ARQ processes in layer 2, and you're retrying, you're just burning energy. You're not transmitting anything, and you're just retrying. So anything that gives you a better radio connection is going to help with that part of the energy budget. Now, there's as we discussed before, Monica, you've got to take the end-to-end story into account. Whatever use case or service you're talking about, you need to be thinking about not just the radio. You've got to be looking at what the core's doing, what are the data centers doing with the service provision, encoder technology, how efficient that is for video. There are many parts in the story about how to create an efficient system, but certainly in the radio, you need to be thinking about how to give the radio link the best chance to perform in an energy efficient way.
And it's hard because, I mean, as I said, we know that that's sort of like a basic, it's better to be close to the base station or access point or whatever you want to call it, or whatever it is. But then it also depends on the usage. Now, before we get into that, we have a question from Pasquale. Hi, Pasquale. And which I think kind of like is actually it's a good way to frame our discussion. So I'm going to read it, especially because people cannot.
Yeah, I can see it here.
Yeah, so I'm going to read it. So recently, Analysys Mason published a study commissioned by Huawei on the carbon footprint of 5G mobile networks. One of the key findings of the study is that and this is quoting the study, is that the carbon emission savings from having less densification in 5G mobile networks outweigh the incremental carbon emission cost of deploying and operating new radios to support the additional mid-band spectrum we have modeled on macro sites and outdoor small cells for the dense urban areas and for macro sites in the rural town or village. What is, Simon, what's your view on that? And I think that when I see things like this, I think that I could make and you can make the argument both ways, depending on the usage profile at that time. I mean, at that time, and that might change, you know, with time. So it's a little bit of a moving target, but it's not that simple of a question, because it depends on where you are.
Totally, and that's the beauty of these. That's the beauty of these studies, and I don't want to cast aspersions on Huawei, but if I were to look at their revenues earned through selling equipment, one may suspect that macro equipment is where they make their money. So fine. And actually, you know, for over a sensible distance, I don't live in a fantasy land where I say a panacea for the future is that we must have, you know, replace the macro networks with small cells everywhere. That would be a ludicrous position to take. You clearly have a heterogeneous network environment, and there will be and there must be macro, high power, high tower as part of a coverage solution. There's no question. The issue is how you reach your capacity. So you've got your coverage, then you need to think about the quality of service, the quality of experience of the systems. And that will come down to, you know, what sort of services are we talking about here when these calculations were being done? Were we just looking at best effort internet-like traffic for a social media app? Or were we thinking about some lower latency, ultra reliable use case where we may need to have multiple connectivity to guarantee the quality and the reliability of the link, where, you know, we may be having to have some high speed round trip time, perhaps there's an edge compute capability in there somewhere. So as soon as you start to expand the layer that's thinking about the services and the applications, then, you know, then I'd like to have a look at that report and ask the question again. But, you know, there's certainly the case that with the right blend of spectrum and power, and importantly, you know, how many devices are we talking about connecting? So each architecture, and this is a thing that's very difficult to manage at a network level, because, you know, the devices and the operators, they're doing a merry dance around who's connected to what tower at what time. And you'll never get the optimal mix. There'll always be issues with mobility and handovers between towers. Are they in the macro layer? Are they in the small cell layer? Where are we in terms of that balance on average? But, you know, on average, if you get your macro towers dimensioned right, and you're sort of mid-loading, you're not overloading your system, but you've got a sensible, respectable amount of load on the macro network, then yeah, I'm sure it's going to be performing well energy efficiency wise.
So I would like to do a little bit of cheating here, and I would like to ask Kendra to show some graphics that I have. And so Kendra, could you show the graph where there are two graphs together? There's actually some data from Huawei. And this is like the absolute numbers don't really matter that much. But this is like this one is from Huawei, one is from CommScope. And I believe that the data is right. I'm not questioning the data, but it's a different way to look at it. So the first one, the Huawei data, is showing that the 5G is much more efficient on a per bit basis at max capacity, basically, you know. And we all agree to that 5G is going to be more efficient. However, if you look at it, at the efficiency at the constant, at the non-peak level, at a lower level, actually is 4G is more efficient. Now, again, forget about the specific details, but what you're seeing is that depending on what the traffic load is, and this is for macros, but then you can make the same argument for you know, small cells. It really depends on what you're using. So the efficiency is different. So back to the, okay, Kendra, I think we're done with this one. The issue is that, let's say you have a macro with a lot of users attached to it, and then you have a small cell with only one user. Well, clearly that one cell is not efficient. So it really depends on how you look at it. So there is really no real
yeah, I mean,
or is it okay? But
we need to be a bit careful on that one, Monica,
okay.
because a small cell, single user, it's an interesting hypothetical. Single user connected to macro versus single user connected to small cell. I mean, one of the dimensions that sometimes I think when you look at industry analysis and claims from vendors, they're keen to show the merits of the technology in terms of the ability to transfer data efficiently. That's a good metric. But there's a baseline of energy power. You've just got to have a baseline to light up the silicon, run the software before you do any protocol processing, to call processing and all. Before you do all that, just get the system up, get the pilots going, and get everything working, so it's a functional network. There's a baseline, and the baseline for a small cell, I guarantee you, is much less than a macro. So then you've got to look at transferring a single user's amount of data, and at the end of the day, that's going to be, you probably wouldn't actually see a great deal of difference in terms. In fact, I would still think probably the small cell will be more efficient, because you're not needing to exercise. This depends, again, a caveat, depends on the architecture of the macro and how well architected it is at low utilization. They may be able to switch off some of the TX, RX channels. They may be able to turn off some of the channel processing on a card by card or subsys or sub card basis. So they're really allowing the single user traffic to go narrowly through a full processing chain, and lots of the system is sleeping. But actually, that's quite hard to do, and a small cell may still be in a better position there. So it's difficult for, before we even start talking about Open RAN, for a vertically integrated single vendor macro to do ultra optimized low user utilization. They have to be very smart in terms of how they architect and how they can power down and optimize, if they're allowed to, by the radio planning of the mobile operator. You can do clever things with turning off carriers and all sorts of things to reduce the energy, the power consumption of the system. But that depends on the policies of the operator as to whether they're willing to turn off carriers if they want to. So there are ways to do it, but it's not a simple equation, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm sort of the single user is kind of the extreme case.
Yeah.
Because you want to, well, then we can get into the Wi-Fi issue as well. But it's how you think about it. But then, as I say, it's how you manage, for instance, sleep. And so there's a lot of tools, but operators are not necessarily using all of them, because clearly the more you sleep, the more you introduce a potential issue that you sleep too much. But then again, you have on a small cell, from the small cell viewpoint, you can also have, and you do, I'm sure you do, have sleep modes. So it's not necessarily true that you're going to have the small cell going full blast 24 hours a day.
No, and I think to be fair to the small cell community, and obviously I do want to be very fair to them. I mean, that is something that has been well understood and known about in terms of how to do that sleep thing, because obviously a very attractive and addressable market for the small cell community, the segment, is the in building, and a lot of them who are addressing that segment are looking at sort of slightly old ways of doing things around what we call the distributed antenna systems, DAS systems, which are generally they still work for medium to large buildings economically. There are always different calculations to be made on a case by case basis. But DAS typically, traditionally, has been a matter of putting in effect a macro or a cut down macro base station in, and then you attenuate the signal. You put a massive attenuator, and you're just burning energy, and then you're just distributing the right. So those approaches, they can still work for some deployments, but the small cell crowd, in terms of trying to outcompete that distributed antenna-like architecture, are getting smarter and smarter around how you can intelligently turn off when not needed the small cells, and to be honest, and this is one of the areas that we discussed before, Monica, actually that's all very well in terms of the tech guys and the OEMs providing their solutions, but there's actually a real pressure, and it comes from the government, local authority, and also the owners of the buildings who are running these buildings. They don't want to pay an energy bill for a bunch of tech that's just going to be sitting there burning energy. And when you come in at a city or a government level, there is legislation coming that's saying we will be monitoring your CO2 footprint impact, and we want you to declare your sustainability goals. So this is where you are today. You take a benchmark, self-certify, and say you're here. Where will you be in 5 years' time? Where will you be in 10 years' time on the energy efficiency of your building? And that includes any wireless stuff that's in there. That isn't excluded. You can't just say, oh, I don't want to care about that. That's not, it all has to be in the equation. So, everyone's putting the pressure on to make sure these things are thought about very carefully.
No, and that's okay. So we have a bunch of questions from the audience, but I'll just wait for a second before I wanted to raise another issue here is that as we try as a society again to be more energy efficient, we have our buildings that are more energy efficient. And as a side effect, an intended side effect, propagation is even worse.
Yeah,
so
totally.
So the indoor use from the same phone that I have now, if I go into a new building, is going to be much higher.
Yeah.
I actually think it's a good thing in a way, because then you have better frequency reuse. But from an energy point of view, the indoor consumption is actually getting worse, other things being equal, just because the windows are more insulated. So that's an issue. But someone, as you say, the question is from a mobile operator, if there is a lot of indoor infrastructure, is a good thing because they get offload, and like for Wi-Fi they get even free offload. So for them it's a net positive. But from the building owner, having indoor infrastructure with small cells, it's a good thing from the tenants or for whatever they're doing. However, from an energy perspective, they're going to see their usage go up. And so we need to, as a society, we need to say, well, but that's a good thing because, okay, your energy goes up, but it goes down for the operator. So net, the overall is actually
right. You
better.
need to take a net view across. And of course, you're offloading from the mobile operators' energy bill, so they're delighted. But from that CO2 footprint reporting perspective that the operators now do. But it's a real thing. You're just offloading the energy budget onto somebody else. But ultimately, the end user, they don't care about the energy bill. I mean, they just want the connectivity. I mean, it's a real issue for us. I mean, for those people in the audience who don't know, I'm also the CEO of a consultancy, an advisory firm that looks at wireless systems, and this is a real system, a real consideration for Real Wireless, my company. When we're working with building owners and architects now, So it's very common for us to be called in very early stage, before they've started digging, working with the architect to say, how do we make connectivity work in this? It's generally a campus, so they will have in-building considerations, but the building owners will also perhaps have a fair amount of land around, and they're also wanting to have connectivity for their tenants also there as well. And there may be that the mobile operators haven't really considered this area to be of great deal of interest. So there's a lot of dynamics there in terms of dealing with the siting of the base stations outside as well as inside. And certainly in the context of these small cell forum, we're closely working with the JOTS initiative in the UK, which is very much looking at that neutral host platform view. And there's a specification for neutral host in building based on small cells. And there's also an initiative now to do a neutral host outdoors as well, which will address exactly this story around small cells deployed in proximity to, outside, a building where you're trying to get a campus coverage like story, and making sure that you're optimizing coverage, service availability, and importantly, the consideration around the power and energy consumption story as well.
We actually have a question about the neutral host, is whether in a neutral host model, whether that will require government intervention. And I personally, I'm not against government intervention, but this is the kind of thing that I really see it hard, that the neutral host sort of has to justify itself. So it's hard to make a mandate to share infrastructure because it's such a sensitive topic. But also, I would say that, and Sam, I'd like to hear what you think about it. Oftentimes, when I talk to real estate owners, they see connectivity as so fundamental to them. It's not so much a revenue opportunity from mobile operators as something that they really want to provide to their tenants. So they can make money, but it's not predicated on the fact that they can get mobile operators to pay.
Yeah, I mean, there are metrics certainly in the sector. I can't remember what we call it. It's building tech, basically. There's a short term for it, but there are metrics around building and the availability of connectivity now. It's part of the selling proposition of the buildings, of the space, especially post-COVID. We're really seeing this question now. Large, there was something in the news last week about a very large bank who's decided to relocate from Canary Wharf and move back into another location to downsize their office. These real estate owners and these guys with large buildings are starting to think carefully about the value proposition of their buildings and how attractive it would be. And part of that, part of the metrics in terms of when people are shopping around looking for offices, is what's the connectivity like for my staff when they're working there, hot desking, or 2 or 3 days a week. The rest of the time they're working from home, fine. That connectivity responsibility is the members of staff, who are working at home. But when you're in the office, obviously the office manager wants to make sure connectivity is working there as well. Now, a lot of that is going to be fixed. Fine, fixed network connection is fine. People are mobile with the handsets and the laptops and all that, and it needs to be carefully thought about in terms of that connectivity. Is certainly absolutely right. A more and more of a consideration.
Yeah, and as I say, fix is still important. However, the real final access is always going to be wireless these days. I mean, laptops don't even have an Ethernet port anymore. So whether it's Wi-Fi or cellular, and in fact, you need both, because you go into a building, you expect to be connected to different networks. So that's really, it's really the wireless infrastructure, and as a tenant, you're not necessarily going to build it. So that's kind of comes with the building, as you say. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah, I think it's actually, if we could find a way to get, to give everyone in effect fiber and mobile fiber, actually fiber is a really generally energy efficient way of transporting data and reality. I mean, obviously, I don't want to do myself out of a job, as I work in the wireless industry, but the reality is that I'm not worried, because everyone wants to be mobile. Everyone wants to, they don't want to be tethered to a desk with a bit of fiber. So it's like a irrelevant discussion in some regards. But actually, the fiber fixed network performance is the benchmark in terms of energy efficiency and connectivity performance. If the wireless industry could only get to the same performance level and efficiency as a fiber-based platform, would be in a good place. But as I say, as we've discussed, there are many architectural challenges there about getting the application. The applications right, and the base station locations to give the flexibility and the quality of coverage and service. That's what creates the challenge for the industry.
But then again, if you have a small cell and a small cell is connected to fiber, you get closer to that
Yeah,
idea.
you're getting closer. Yeah, you're getting closer to that ideal world. Yeah.
Clearly, access is still, it's still better if you have the wireline thing. But now that brings, so I see there's a few questions about Wi-Fi, and I think that there is the issue that comes up all the time, but there is also a special issue with respect of energy consumption with Wi-Fi. So in every building, you're going to have Wi-Fi. So the small cells go on top of it. So the question is that if you have Wi-Fi and cellular, so is that the best way to go, or should you say, well, let's just do Wi-Fi because it's just one network and it just takes care of all the traffic? That's more energy efficiency. So I'm going to have another cheat here. And Kendra, could you show the other figure, the one where with
it's almost like the audience knew you had this slide prepared.
Yes. So I feel bad, but that's it's easier. So if somebody compare the CO2 emissions when you look at 1 hour of streaming in the US, and this data is for other countries as well. And clearly the biggest change depends on the device you're using. However, if you look at the same device, say a smartphone, and you use LTE or Wi-Fi, it looks like 4G is more efficient if the load on Wi-Fi is high, but it's less efficient if the load on Wi-Fi is low. So basically, it really depends on how much use there is, and it sort of intuitively makes sense. If you're at home, you have a Wi-Fi access point, and you're the only device is your phone. It's not very efficient, generally speaking. Now, okay, I think we're done with this, but the thing is that the numbers here, I don't know exactly how they got to those numbers, and you probably can get different numbers, but I think it's an interesting way to think about it, that is not just the interface that determines the efficiency, but how many people use it.
Yeah, I think, totally.
And so Simon, maybe you can tell me what you think about this approach. How is that going to help us?
I've never been a believer in saying that we're going to, or the Wi-Fi is not a part of the story. Wi-Fi is a good heavy lifter of data. So I think this point about the number of users on the Wi-Fi is useful to think about. Again, I think to some extent it comes down to the sort of cultural engineering focus of the cellular crowd, so to speak, who have been desperate. I may be being a bit unfair to the Wi-Fi community, but I think generally they've been very focused on IT connectivity, laptops, and those sort of things. That's where they started, and obviously, Wi-Fi is embedded in smartphones. So I'm talking about history to some extent. But you can see that even for a single user on the cellular system, especially if you have in mind, how do I do this in the most energy efficient way? And I go all the way through the layers, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and say, what, if I've got a smart LTE scheduler and I want to be able to turn off resource blocks in a radio frame, and I just focus on one user that's connected, and we know the devices are, the cellular devices are engineered within an inch of their life to be maximizing battery life. I'm fairly convinced that you will find, if you did an experiment, that the cellular wireless link would be better for a single user. But yes, if you get more and more devices in the home or in the office that are connected, there'll be a sweet spot where Wi-Fi will be pretty much the same, or maybe better, depending on the loading. As a cellular system, it could well be the case. So you've got to take a view on average across that piece. It's not an easy equation. I don't see that. Actually, if people are looking for winning arguments around the energy efficiency debate to push out or cancel one technology or another, I think don't bother. There are other competing metrics around pricing of the access points, and the cost of the hardware and the maintenance costs and all those other dimensions, which are probably still mostly going to win the arguments, depending on which deployment you're looking at.
Yeah, and generally speaking, as I was doing the research for the report, I was trying to figure out, the energy consumption in general, high level, Wi-Fi versus cellular, and well, it is actually fundamentally different. So to make a clear comparison, where like the graph that I show you, it's actually it's nearly impossible. I mean, one that you can say, okay, in my home, how is that compared? That I can figure it out. Look at historical data. I can, well, no, I'm not going to do that, but it's possible. But to generalize, I think it's it's interesting to think about it, but it's nearly impossible to give a general answer.
I think what was really interesting for me, I did a couple of months ago, we had the Small Cell World Summit, and we had it was soon after my discussion with you, Monica, and that triggered us to have a sustainability session in the summit, and we had some really interesting inputs. And one of the questions on this Wi-Fi that came up was very interesting, which I hadn't really considered, from one of the biggest mobile operator, or the biggest operator, they're converged these days in the UK. Their comment, which was quite interesting for a small cell crowd to hear. In the UK, we're about to turn off 3G, and there's been a long discussion about why on earth we're keeping 2G, 3G, because these are not energy efficient technologies. They're still, there was still lit those carriers in the UK. And one of the cases for turning off the technology as quickly as possible is, it's not the most energy efficient way of transporting the data. So let's get on with it and close it down. Fine. And so BT is saying, yeah, we're on with that, and they're going to start aggressively turning off the 3G carrier. And then we were discussing what's the implication in terms of voice services. So forget about all the fancy other services of 4G and 5G. Let's just go to voice. And the comment from the gentleman from BT was that, well, that's fine. We're going to go to voice over Wi-Fi. That's going to be the solution. So anywhere in building where voice is not working because the 3G bearer is turned off, we're going to go from having carried that signal and that service over 3G, we're going to move, assumption is, it will just be actually carried over Wi-Fi, voice over Wi-Fi service. And there we go. We've moved from one technology to the other as we've turned it off, gone into the Wi-Fi space, and that's a voice service. Now, what will that, his proposition was, because 3G is so poorly performing energy-wise, going to a Wi-Fi with a smaller cell architecture for those voice services, net will be better energy efficiency-wise. That's fine. So he didn't mention voice over LTE or anything like that in the small cell. It was a Wi-Fi story, but that's interesting, So that's a big cellular operator saying, actually, we're saying this is energy saving, switching off 3G, and we're also quite happy to put it on voice over Wi-Fi, and that will still be a net gain for the energy budget for BT.
Yeah, but isn't the problem that a lot of the people that have a 3G phone, they might be in rural area, or they might want to use their phone in a wide area network, and there,
I mean, obviously, don't forget that 2G is still there. We're talking about an interim step here. The other problem, of course, is, and 2G is a good example of, it's a very mature technology, and there's a lot of machine to machine and other use cases,
yes.
and e-health, e-call. So it's become embedded in some application areas or some services, not just for voice, but for other services.
Like utilities.
Yeah, utilities, totally. Yeah. So that is going to take some unpicking. And the UK is sort of pressing on with that, and certainly Real Wireless is involved in those discussions in terms of that area. But you can see that it will have an implications for the small cell. It should have, it's an opportunity for the small cell ecosystem as well to play into that. And the other important change that's coming with the 3G switch off is decoupled, but it is the way in which the PSTN is being turned off as well. So a lot of the old switching technology in the core is going, and there's a transformation happening there in the fixed networks as well, and that's all happening, and that will change the way in which connectivity is offered as well into the enterprise and other spaces.
Yes, and as promised, we have a lot of things that we have to talk about. We also have a lot of questions from the audience, so let me know to some of them. Okay, so there is one about 6G. What's the role of, this is again from Pasquale, is the KPIs for 6G? What is the relative goal for small cells as we go to 6G? And I think that this is just, we're gonna see more small cell type of infrastructure, or moving away from macro, because as you go up in the spectrum bands, you have to, I mean, at some point it's not even a choice, you have to go to smaller elements.
Oh yeah, totally. You can see, Monica, I mean, and it's a good question. For me, it's a fantastic opportunity. I mean, 6G in terms of the bits of spectrum that are being talked about. You've got to go to really for energy efficiency, if nothing else. You're going to have to bear in mind the physics of the propagation of the signal, and that's going to naturally evolve to a more densified, in terms of the number of the intersite distance is going to have to drop down. But that's going to be it's going to be on a place-based. What's the demand in the network in this location? What's the traffic? What are we forecasting as the traffic and the traffic growth? And that will drive the changing of the grid and the dimensioning. So I mean, it's definitely the opportunity. Now, in terms of the specifics of KPIs, I mean, the Small Cell Forum is we're certainly not a research forum. We're very focused on the product ecosystem. So we do have a sustainability and a 6G program thinking within the forum. So I'm more than happy for people to approach the forum for to talk about membership and things. But so we haven't published anything yet. So it's all internal thinking. But clearly there will be some KPIs that start to tell a story and shape the way that we'd like people to think about how to do the densification. And I think my general observation at the moment is on the 6G discussion. We first of all we need to work out how we're going to deal with the Open RAN and the phasing of Open RAN. The first rising wave of capital investment in 5G has passed, and Open RAN didn't slot in there. There's going to have to be, for some markets, not all, but for some markets, especially where governments have started to press for the diversification, there's going to have to be an Open RAN investment. And how that's phased with the 6G investment, that needs to be worked out. I mean, that's a story of the next 5 to 10 years. But I think one of the technology areas that really is interesting conceptually in 6G is how is AI going to play, and how cognizant of energy consumption will the AIs be? Because we're talking about the concepts as we discussed, Monica. They're very difficult at a system level to wrap your arm around and say this is the answer, because there's so many it depends how much traffic, how many devices, how dense is the network, what technology you want. So those variables are going to have to be, and I think it's sort of place-based oriented optimization is going to happen, and it may have to flex depending on the traffic loading on the network. So in a particular place, it may be low utilization in the evening, for example, if it's mostly an enterprise user space. And there may need to be an expanding of the thought process of the AI to manage the energy consumption down. Then it's thinking ahead and saying, right now, rush hour's coming, I'm going to start expanding in some way the capacity of the network, and the energy consumption on the network is going to start going up the baseline in terms of availability of connectivity, etc. So, and that I think is essential. If the industry doesn't deliver on some of those AI automated ways of managing networks, not just for traffic that's on the network, but when there's no traffic on the network and you need to work out how to optimize, if you don't get hold of that story correctly in the investment in 5G, we're in 6G, we're going to be in trouble. Because, as I said earlier, there are other pressures outside of the telecoms technology space, regulations coming from government saying we have a net zero target. We can't afford all this energy going into the telecom sector so people can pass around their cat videos on Facebook. If people don't show value in terms of the connectivity and trade that off, that benefit against the cost, and get that net zero calculation right, connectivity will be squeezed out as would be nice to have, but it's not essential. So we need to stay cognizant of those pressures in the wider society, and showing that we're addressing the energy consumption much better than we did for 5G. Yeah.
Well, and obviously 6G is work in progress. I've heard the argument that AI itself uses so much energy that might actually, I just don't buy the argument, because that's the thing, is that eventually you get, so on day one, you're gonna, in order to train an AI system, you're gonna require a lot of energy probably, but still within reason. But in the long term, I mean, come on. Then you're doing something wrong if that's
the jury's out, and this is a very hot topic. You're touching on a sweet spot in terms of the research ecosystem in the UK, Monica. We're Real Wireless is associated with a project called Reason, which is a 6G research program funded by the UK government, and that's one of the hot topics that we were discussing. There was an architecture meeting yesterday, addressing exactly this point. How is the AI? How do we optimize the AI? How do we not let it become too generalized that it just burns energy? But there are, for those skilled in the art of AI, and I won't claim to be one of those. So I'm learning like a lot of other people. Finding the right foundation model, finding the right training of that foundation model. You can do that in an energy optimized way, and then you launch it on the networks so that it's optimized. So you've thought about those things about just throwing an AI out there into the network and then create the foundation model and do all the training live in a network. Then we will have a disaster. But there are ways to do things in a much more engineering oriented way, which I hope the industry will be doing. And certainly from a small cell forum perspective, we will be definitely encouraging that approach. We don't want to have, it would be great to have AI embedded in the small cell layer, and in fact I think that's essential. But what we don't want to have is this AI in the small cell layer that's inefficient and killing off all the benefits that we have in terms of energy efficiency for what is fundamentally the primary purpose of the systems, which is to make connectivity, wireless connectivity, and everyone to be able to access services. So yeah, we will definitely need to play that carefully.
Now, let me follow up on the 6G, which this is a little my pet thing that I really think I'm really excited about it, but not too many people are, or not yet, and which is risk. So basically you just do passive transmission using reflection, and that doesn't requires hardly any energy. So it's energy efficient, and as you move high in the frequency, it's a way to kind of do a sort of like a densification at a lower cost than the sort of traditional macro or small cell. And it's mostly people use it for outdoors, but I think it's a great opportunity, and maybe even better opportunity for indoors. But I think I'm on the very few people are on that. So what do you think about? Is risk for real? Is it useful?
I think it's a really good research topic. I mean, I think the initial, I mean, certainly there's some universities in the UK are doing some thought leadership on it, and I've heard their presentations, and it sounds interesting. I know that it's a topic of active research. I don't. It feels a little bit because there's different. So when you start unpicking the risk story, and there's passive and active, and different methodologies are being talked about, and until first of all, they've got to get a clear system solution that works reliably, just to make the connectivity work. That's the important thing, and then we can maybe have a start to have a think about the energy story in terms of whether it's going to affect or how it affects the radio propagation and the efficiency of the system from that perspective. I mean, it seems to be it's quite within the radio layer. It's in that radio domain in terms of the end to end. Like you showed with that graph that showed a kettle boiling, and you've got or an Amazon streaming service over an hour, and you've actually got a fair chunk, not a huge amount, but there's a data center in there, and there's this and that. Actually, when you break down each of those chunks, then and start to really narrow it down into the radio domain, then will risks make a huge difference at a CO2 footprint and energy budget across the end-to-end piece? I'm not sure. I don't have the answer, but it feels like maybe not. It's my gut instinct at this stage.
Absolutely. And I think we're at the end of the hour. So anything that you would like, I'll give you 1 minute if you want to go through any of the questions or anything you would want to touch upon. Since we covered a lot, but we still have, we can still go on for a few more hours.
Yeah, I mean, we could have gone on for another hour. I don't think I've got covered most of the areas. I'm quite happy. I think the one area that I would say that we're looking at quite closely in the small cell forum is worth noting is the we're building a relationship with the ORAN Alliance, and we're it's part of our sustainability piece, looking at how the small cell layer plays into that Open RAN view of the world. And we have a tool that we use to analyze some of the layer 1, layer 2 interfacing, sort of FAPI interface. So it's a darts tool that allows us to analyze in quite some detail the throughput, the system throughput requirements. And we're investigating the feasibility of adding an energy efficient consideration into there. So for me, that's something that's brewing in the background. I just want to bring to the audience's attention, because I know there's a lot of interest in the sort of FAPI related interfacing, which is in this different split discussion about Open RAN. It's a split 6 discussion, but the darts tool allows us to revisit that architecting discussion for small cell as we go towards 6G. We may say, actually, we're favouring, fine, split 6 works well for an LTE small cell system and for 5G. As we move into 6G, we may need to re-architect, and we're very much involved in thinking about how that will shape up.
Now, since I've been cheating already with the figures, maybe I'll cheat by asking another question. I see some of the people are still on, but I have a little burning question here, which is with Open RAN. It's not necessarily about energy efficiency, but there is some people have the view that, and I used to have that view, that as you go to small cells, you don't need Open RAN just to a small cell. Why would you need it? And now I come around and I think that small cells need Open RAN just as much as anybody else. But what is your view on that? Okay, so my question to you, which is, that was, I mean, why would a small cell need to use Open RAN?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think that for me, it comes down to a philosophy around open networks. And we really struggled a little bit over the years to get the interoperability between the macro layer and the small cell layer to work, because there's a pinch point in terms of some of the interfaces and how open they are, really. And that that's a story of vendor lock-in and control in particular standards bodies, and I'm not going to name and shame parties here. We all know the suspects, but ultimately, for the good of the industry as a whole, the small cell community is very happy and delighted to see the macro layer area continue to evolve. That's fine. I think that having an Open RAN philosophy, which sort of expands into an open networks like thinking of the world, which sort of rides the wave in terms of flexibility of architecture. So you're really getting to a true HETNET-like environment where you don't have, in effect, industry forced interoperability issues between the macro layer and the small cell layer. We really need to break those down, because there's a place in the market for all of these different variant platforms, and to get to the best place energy efficiency performance wise, we do need to make that a more seamless transition in terms of how devices can connect to different layers, so the best connect, and that requires a nice interface and interoperability between that macro and that small cell layer.
Absolutely. And yeah, I'm completely with you. It's the openness that really matters. So even if you have it doesn't matter where the DU is, let's put it this way. Yeah. You just want to have an open network. And by the way, this Open RAN is making cellular more open than Wi-Fi. Because Wi-Fi, when you look at it from the management of the network management point of view, is actually not open at all. The access is open. But anyway,
that's another discussion.
That's for a different day.
I'm more than happy to join you for a management I mean that has been an ongoing issue for many. I mean, it is actually an issue for the cellular community as well. I mean, it's part of the control of, again, it's the vendor side, OSS, BSS, and the management layer, and how that's percolates through to the RAN and the core. It's always been, because it's a different set of vendors. There's always been some issues there.
Yeah, but there's a lot of change going on. Well, Simon, thank you so much. As I said, we could go on for another hour or two, but we need to go on with our lives. So thank you so much for participating in the Sparring Partners.
Thank you, Monica. I really enjoyed it, and we should do it again.
Absolutely. And Kendra, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you to our speakers. That will conclude our webinar for today. You will find a recording of today's webinar available at the senseofphilly.com website in the coming days. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.